Thank you, Sue, for those discussant remarks. I mean, one theme that connects both of these papers, as I suggested at the beginning, is the relationship between North Korea's nuclear diplomacy and its survivability. And I think that to put a finer point on Sue's comments, is it possible to imagine a change in North Korea's strategic outlook without regime change? And with that, we'll open it up to the floor for questions on any of the papers or to try to bring things together. Who would like to go first? Kathy. There's a mic. Identify yourself and... Okay.
Well, you know me. Kathy Moon. I will be speaking tomorrow, but I teach at Wellesley College. To push Sue's point in another direction, we're looking at, I'd like to think about and get your thoughts on potential internal pressures for that strategic shift. So far, all the panelists have focused on the regime itself, the state apparatus, basically. And I'd like you to talk to us a bit about what you may know or what you may be able to conjecture about the potential for North Korean citizens to become better informed about what's going on, because we already know it's happening in pockets. And books like Barbara Demick's or Andrei Lankov's work, they're very revealing in showing us a larger, more textured and dynamic picture of North Korea than most Americans, at least, get through the newspapers. So what are the potential... I won't even say, dissident activities. I won't even go that far. But however you may want to describe what's going on in everyday North Korean society that could serve as pressure points, but also either lead to a sudden regime collapse. And I mean, I have my own scenarios, but I'd like to hear yours. And the kind of responses that the international community might be forced to step in with.
You want to take a bunch of questions, or?
Sure. Well, so far there was only one hand, so okay. Well, why don't we take a couple of questions? We've got another person over here.
Bob Swittinger from Central Technology. Oftentimes we talk about a collapse of the North Korean system as if that it's something that we'll see. And that it will have defining characteristics and everybody will know it when it happens. I think there's reason to question that. And the question that I am asking all of the panelists is, what is a collapse of the North Korean regime going to look like? How will we know? For example, you could make the case that the economic system has already collapsed and that it is dependent upon international aid in order for its continued sustenance. Political system, certainly everybody would assume that when Kim Jong-il disappears, that will be the collapse of the regime, but I'm not sure, in fact, that that's the case. So I'm looking for what might be realistic perceptions or guesses or scenarios on your part of what we should actually be looking for when we talk about a collapse of the North Korean regime.
I'll take one more this round from over here, and then we'll come back to our panelists. Right over here. There we go.
Thank you. Donna Weeks from Australia. And I guess being from Australia, I take a slightly different perspective on how we see the Korean Peninsula from down under as opposed to from across the Pacific. And I'm a little surprised that in this panel we haven't heard anything about the six-party talks, which in Australia we might try to keep a little bit of hope about. Are the six-party talks done with, over, finished? I'd like your comments, please.
Okay. Jonathan, would you like to start?
Thank you for all the questions. Kathy Moon raises an operative consideration of, is there a quote unquote a North Korea that we don't know? And by that, I assume you mean that within the system or within the society, people either do some measure of their own thinking. They certainly take demonstrably are taking initiative of their own sorts just simply for purposes of economic survival. And I would agree with you in different ways. Both Andrei Lankov and Barbara Demick capture that. It's a reminder of what people do under what are demonstrably very, very problematic circumstances. The question, as always, is one of scale and scope, and it's not unrelated to what Bob has just posed here as well. It's less what the thoughts that people may entertain and more their actual overt behavior, if you will. So let me differentiate, however, that it seems to me the operative consideration would be, to get to Bob's question about what would a collapse look like. I'm not talking now about the precise scenario. I mean, we can tie ourselves in knots around that, and it really, at some level, it's not terribly useful, even though it's fun of a sort, or fodder, if you will, for intellectual activity. It would have to be a central attenuation of the loyalty that core strategic elites, core elites within the system attach to its preservation. I mean, to put it crassly, are there people who are ready to die for the regime? Or alternatively, are circumstances so transformed that, for example, that would Kim Jong-il's death or his lasting incapacitation, that is, by the way, another scenario. I mean, we have an example of this in the case of Israel right now, where you have a brain dead prime minister who is kept alive, no doubt, with very, very good medical care. Now, does that have operative political consequences? A lot of it depends, looking again at North Korea, at whether or not we see such cumulative pressures of one kind or another for change that even a system that is looking for the right adjective, I can't quite find it at the moment, but a system that so inhibits expressions and activities at a kind of an organized level would not be able to resist anymore. Now, the challenge, it seems to me, in part, even as people assume the inevitability of this happening, is that there really are four scenarios for the future. I mean, a lot of talk, of course, the preferred one would be some kind of proverbial soft landing. The second is a hard landing. The operative preference of the leadership of North Korea, at least as they expressed it, is what I call the no landing scenario. Some kind of a system that persists, but with some measure of modification to keep on going. And the fourth scenario, of course, is and one that's if you will, popular right now. Scott's associated with some of it, if dare I say, the whole idea that there could be some kind of an internal crisis, humanitarian crisis or whatever, that has genuine consequences for instability that affect neighbors and that might have an impact on what other outside powers do. I would argue that these are all very, very different cases, and I'm not making a prediction about one or another. I would say that the system is, to put it mildly, remarkably resilient. I don't think it gives off the vibes of the kind, to use who was the why am I blocking out his name? The Harvard economist Hirschman. The whole idea of an either giving voice or exit from the regime. For example, it's my understanding that of the approximately 20,000 North Korean defectors who are now in the ROK, perhaps 2 to 3% come from more privileged classes. I don't know if that's an accurate characterization. That tells us something. Most of those who flee are fleeing more for economic reasons, and to base it on what Barbara Demick has written, she does it, most of it's by opportunistic reasons. A door opens, literally, and you walk through it. So it may well be that, but it just seems to me, reflecting on the fact, whatever the reasons may be, that 20 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of in Eastern Europe, which had, I think, in many, many ways, much more of an effect, the Eastern Europe end, than the Soviet end. they're still alive. They may be defying the laws of gravity, but somehow it has persisted, and I think we need to understand those reasons why as best we can. To get to the six-party talks question, I wish I could give you some encouragement there, but I can't. In any event, regardless of whether we think there is value or not, I think we need to differentiate a process, a meeting ground, from what goes into it. Everyone will say, well, we want a diplomatic outcome. Who can be against that? Now, diplomacy sometimes can ratify an existing set of circumstances as distinct from diplomacy which actually helps shape a different reality. But I think that there is an enormous chastening and sobriety now about the utility of the talks. Indeed, to get to Professor Lee's observation about the extent to which North Korea over the last 20 years has always endlessly exploited opportunities, well, they seem now to be confronting a different reality. You have an American president who doesn't want to participate in that process. Now, you could say that there are risks in that. The risks or liabilities might be, number one, if you would really like to be present and accounted for within the DPRK, you are, in essence, denying yourself that possibility to the degree that you choose not to interact extensively with the North. That's also the case with South Korea. I mean, in some sense, if the belief is that there are things that could be entrained within the North, do we deny ourselves the means to influence that, or is there a different way to basically insert ourselves in that process? The other liability, obviously, is that to the degree that North Korea continues to feel unconstrained except by whatever the limits might be on its available technical and industrial means, it will presumably persist with its nuclear weapons development. And I guess the judgment has to be that whatever that outcome, we will have other ways to mitigate those risks and hope it doesn't get too far. But that's worthy of a longer talk. But the six-party talk process, I don't hear a lot of encouragement on that from any quarter.
At the same time, if I may be so bold as to say, yes, the United States, and I applaud the U.S. policy and South Korea's policy of strategic patience, not rushing to the negotiating table whenever North Korea creates a new crisis. Whereas the dear leader has shown himself to be an impatient patient ever since he suffered his stroke. He tried to rush through the succession process and recently apparently has slowed it down. On the other hand, after a decent interval, say 3 months or 4 months, and North Korea making some gesture of culpability for the sinking of the South Korean Navy's ship, it is also plausible that we will have the resumption of the six-party talks. That is a possibility because throughout history, over the past 20 years, that is the pattern that we have observed. The six-party talks have not been successful in their ultimate intention, its raison d'etre, denuclearization of North Korea, although the Korean Peninsula is the phrase that we use upon North Korea's insistence. At the same time, it has been useful as a forum for gathering information, intelligence, assessing intent, and sharing blame. So there is utility to the six-party talks. I think the flow of information, merchandise, goods like DVDs and so forth into North Korea in recent years is a sign of the regime's erosion of information control. And if we see a big change, if there is a big change in North Korea, I think it will be visible. We will be able to discern big changes in North Korea from the North Korean people by information going out of North Korea. When I say regime collapse, I don't necessarily mean a big bang. I think throughout history, many regimes have come to an end with a whimper, not necessarily a bang. And it could be a series of events. We could have a smooth transition of power from Kim Jong-il to one of his sons. That is certainly a possibility. we could also have a relatively bloodless coup d'etat in North Korea, as South Korea experienced in 1961. But as time goes on, I think we can also reasonably see that the regime's hold on power, the control over the population, facing its insurmountable economic problems, and the prospect of having to compete with an immeasurably richer, freer South Korea, presents an existential challenge to this regime and the next regime. And when you think of history in terms of rise and fall of dynasties, the average lifespan of a Chinese dynasty is 3 generations. It's a challenge to keep private wealth within the same family across 3 generations. It is a very difficult challenge that the North Korean regime faces due to its peculiar structure, but also due to the existence of South Korea. South Korea is not just an abstract alternative to the North Korean people. The folks in Eastern Europe during the Cold War, many knew of a better world out there, but to the North Koreans, this is a palpable, a realistic opportunity to resettle in the North. And the fact that we have, as Professor Pollack mentioned, some 20,000 North Koreans today who took great risks to come to the South presents the North Korean regime with, I would say, an insurmountable existential challenge.
Sue, do you want to?
Just quickly, to answer your question, yes, there is absolutely information penetration in North Korea, and North Korean citizens are absolutely better informed through the porous border. You just mentioned about the radios, the TV shows, and everything else. They're better informed, but we still, in terms of scale and scope, we still popular uprising as a least likely scenario, the trigger of regime collapse. And the most likely trigger, we see it as a fractured elite unity, possibly following a succession crisis. Now, after Kim Jong-il dies, it does not mean that we will be seeing a regime collapse. In fact, regime change scenario is the most likely scenario, with either Kim Jong-un at the top or some sort of collective leadership with Jong-un as a symbol. That's probably going to go on for some time, but eventually, as you know, as in the long term, we see that as sort of it's not durable. And so the fractured elite unity is the most likely scenario that we see. In terms of what is the collapse of North Korean regime look like, again, there's regime change, there's regime collapse. In terms of regime collapse, we're just talking about a complete collapse of the central authority as we know it. In that situation, we're looking at either a chaos or some sort of civil war scenario. But, yeah.
Okay. Now that we've got the discussion warmed up, it's going to be my job to try to bring it to a screeching halt because the next panel starts at 2. But I saw at least one. If we can get maybe 2 more brief questions in. David Lampton first.
David Lampton at SICE. You all mentioned China's reluctance to engage in what-if kinds of discussions and so forth. This still leaves open the possibility that the United States could unilaterally deliver messages to China about, A, what we hope you do or don't do under various contingencies and what we're prepared to do or not do under various contingencies. And I guess my question is, what should we be telling the Chinese even if we're not having a discussion?
If there's not anybody else, then we will make that. Did you have? Okay. That's the last question, and we look forward to hearing your answers.
For all the attention that scholars and analysts like to give to the idea of planning ahead, a lot of governmental activity ends up being reactive when you confront it, and this would be a case in point. We have grappled, and Mike is absolutely right, with an inability to get to some kind of common conception of what the risks are with vis-a-vis China. And there are many, many reasons for it. You know, I'm always fond of recalling when Woody Hayes, the famous football coach at the school that you used to teach at years ago, was once asked, you know, how come he didn't throw more forward passes? He said, because, well, there are 3 things that can happen when you throw football, and 2 of them aren't any good. And I think that the Chinese, despite all the characterizations of their growing weight and influence, are skittish in the extreme about involvement here. Part less, I think, out of some concern that there's enormous latent instability in the North. These arguments about massive refugee flows. I mean, frankly, I don't worry about that too much. I don't think the PLA worries about that too much either. There are ways you can control that. What they do worry about is conduct by a leadership in the North that they don't know how to come to terms with, and in some sense maybe even fear to a certain extent. That's a different kind of argument, but that's a basis on which, if we could have a candid exchange with China, it would be greatly to be desired. So I would hope that quietly, maybe perhaps through not formal governmental channels, but other kinds of means, we keep this discussion going, because it's my own view that there is a lot of debate in China about these issues, some of it quiet, some of it not so quiet. And I don't think that the Chinese position, whatever that is necessarily as fixed as many make it out to be, for many of the reasons that I think, for example, Professor Lee noted before. The center of gravity for China on the peninsula changed a long time ago, and it changes more all the time. Indeed, I'm very struck that when Kim Jong-il made his most recent visit to China, Hu Jintao made some very, very interesting remarks that sort of laying out, here's what a normal relationship would look like with another state. And what I think Hu was saying in his own way is, we don't have one. Whether they get one, whether the North Koreans feel even more impelled to respond is an open question. I would note, though, that in the near term, the dependence on China, given the changes in the aftermath of the sinking of the Tiangnan, is going to go up even more. So there we are, and there they are in their neighborhood.
Closing comments from Sung-Yun?
During the Korean War, the Chinese intervened only at the last minute as Kim Il-sung stood with his back against the Yalu River. And preserving the political entity called North Korea, the DPRK, that carried symbolic significance, which is no longer in existence in my view. The political or the territorial integrity of North Korea, how it may have been diminished in size, how big it was due to the advancing UN troops, that was a secondary consideration. Today, there are problems with respect to China's immediate border regions within North Korea, the northern provinces, North Pyongan, Yangang, Chagang, and North Hamgyong provinces, because there are military installations, and the United States will have a strong incentive to be present in those nuclear sites and military bases. But once that dust settles, and I think, again, keeping communication lines open with China with respect to that operation is essential, there is really no need for the United States to maintain troops close to China. And I think the U.S. can withdraw its troops south of the 38th parallel and remind the Chinese that a unified Korea with its capital city in Seoul poses really no strategic or economic threat to China, a nation of 70 million people, with strong atavistic romantic attachment to China. There is no major virulent anti-Chinese sentiment in South Korea. Again, unified Korea will be necessarily pro-China, and that will not infringe in any way on Chinese strategic or economic interests. So as long as Chinese economic interests in unified Korea can be guaranteed, as long as the United States communicates to China that we pose no threat to you and we'll remove our troops down south, I think, rationally speaking, the Chinese will not have a strong incentive to risk going to war against the ROK or the United States over this political entity, this moribund economy known as the DPRK.
I want to thank both of our presenters and our discussant for being concise and providing a lot of good comment and insight with regard to these issues. I want to thank you all for the questions, and let's just thank our presenters with a round of applause.